Regina Doherty, why haven't your government tried to reform the Seanad?
I think the political reform package that this government has been clearly set out insofar as that the reform that we're suggesting is changing from a bicameral system to a unicameral system. And the reason we haven't tried to reform the Seanad is because recreating a second Dáil does absolutely no favours for the people of this country except give a second chamber that does exactly the same as what the first chamber does, and that would be a complete and utter waste of money. The reforms that are being suggested by Democracy Matters is to increase the voting population to allow every citizen in the country have a vote to elect their senators.
Yes.
That doesn't affect what the Seanad does or doesn't do. That doesn't affect the powers of the Seanad, which we believe are so limited and have only been used twice in 75 years, thus rendering it very, very ineffective. What we're proposing is huge political reform. It's asking the Irish people, in a modern society with a population of just over 4 million, do we need two chambers of Parliament to run our government effectively in this country? And we believe the answer to that is no.
You say you're offering massive political reform, but again, I put the same point that I put to Gary Murphy. What's on the ballot paper for people here is a very simple choice: keep it or scrap it. You contend the Seanad should be scrapped and the Dáil strengthened, committees beefed up, but that's not on offer in this referendum. We've no guarantee that if we do vote to scrap the Seanad, you'll do what you say you will do.
Well, I think there is no choice but to do it, but obviously our will and our intent is to beef up the legislative process. At the moment, it's a very reactive process, insofar as that, a minister or government officials draft a piece of legislation that's then presented to the Houses of Parliament for debate. As we've seen in the last year with two separate bills, the Protection of Life and Pregnancy Bill and the Children's Rights legislation, they were both given to the Health Committee in draft format, in heads of bill format. Oral hearings ensued, expert witnesses were brought in to allow us to have their expertise, their input into the drafting of legislation, which is where legislation should be teased out and scrutinised, so that when the first draft is presented, to your democratically elected politicians, it's already been thoroughly bandied about and improved. And so as to make the legislative process far more, transparent, far more input is put into it by your national politicians and obviously the expertise of particular people who have expertise with regard to the relevant legislation that we would be discussing. And then you would have the review stage at the end of it, whereby once a piece of legislation is enacted, the particular minister will have to come back 12 months later to make sure that that piece of legislation does exactly what it says on the tin.
Gary Murphy, name me one significant thing the Seanad has ever done.
Well, that question, has been bandied about for some time. The current Seanad has implemented or put in place 500 and odd amendments to government legislation. When you say maybe one significant thing, I'm not here to defend the current Seanad, or I'm not here to defend the 1937.
But you're asking people to vote yes in a referendum to keep the Seanad. So give me one good thing it's ever done.
Well, it offers an alternative viewpoint by politicians and those who aren't elected by the Taoiseach's nominees, an oversight of legislation.
Aside from an offer, what has it ever done?
Well, I'm not here to defend the current Seanad. It's elitist, it's undemocratic. I think the current government's proposals are, in terms of what Regina has just said, are deeply sceptical, because what an alternative Seanad could do is it would be giving a second view. If we take the government's committee reform, it's the same people looking at the same legislation. What the Seanad does is offers an alternative view. The Seanad was set up to offer, it's about opinion. That's why the vocational panels exist in terms of agriculture, education, commerce, etc. When you say what has the Seanad ever done, there's been many very important people who've served in the Seanad who aren't famous for being in the Seanad but have contributed to Irish life.
Not through the Seanad.
Not through the Seanad, but they have made a contribution when they've been in the Seanad. The Seanad could work if it was given the opportunity. That's the point we in Democracy Matters are making. We're not here to defend previous Seanad. What we're here to do is to suggest that there is an alternative which the government is reluctant to put forward to the people.
Regina Doherty, what do you say about the offering an alternative because you mentioned two bills, the Protection of Life during Pregnancy and the one on children's rights, which have been extensively scrutinised in the Dáil, but there is a lot of legislation, particularly in relation to emergency finance measures, which have just been rushed through the Dáil with nobody else having a look at it. Doesn't that need further oversight?
Well, obviously it does, but there's a reason for those emergency bills.
Like the bank guarantee, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, there were economic, and emergency reasons for those putting through. But I think history has shown us that when those things have been done in such an emergency fashion, they haven't always come out to be, what they should have been in the first place. That's why the legislative process needs to be changed. There needs to be far more scrutiny before a bill even hits its first stage, and that's what we're proposing.
Okay.
But I would suggest that the false choice is actually being offered by Democracy Matters and the people who are advocating for reform. The Seanad hasn't been able to reform itself in 75 years, and offering a false promise.
But it hasn't been able to reform itself because it hasn't been given the opportunity by the
10
governments
reports.
of the day. But
10
those 10
reports
reports haven't been acted on, Regina, with all due respect, by the political elites of the day. We are a civil society group. I have no political allegiance whatsoever.
From all different shapes and forms of parties, and in 75 years, not one political party has ever had the will to reform it.
Okay.
Governments could have had that opportunity and should have done something with it.
Okay, I'll leave the last word to Gary there. Gary Murphy from Democracy Matters, Regina Doherty from Fine Gael. 5 more weeks to debate. You'll be voting on Friday, October the 4th.